The night air over Villisca was heavy and still, like the world itself was holding its breath. At 508 East 2nd Street, a small white house rested under a June moon. Inside, 8 people slept, 6 from the Moore family, and 2 young girls staying over. By morning, not a single one of them would ever wake again. This was no ordinary murder. It was precise, deliberate, almost ceremonial. The curtains were pulled tight as if to keep the night from looking in. The mirrors were covered like someone feared what they might reflect. Food was left on the kitchen table, half-eaten. Lamps were turned low. Every detail told the same story. This was not panic. This was preparation. The axe blows came one by one with brutal accuracy. No screams, no desperate escapes, no chance for help. Even the family dog never barked. Neighbors later said it was as if the whole house had been swallowed by something dark and ancient. When the sheriff walked in at sunrise, the air inside was warm and still, and smelled of iron and kerosene. In the upstairs bedroom, he found the Moore children laid out as if they were sleeping. A blood-soaked cloth had been carefully placed over one child's face, as if the killer could not bear to see her eyes staring back. And yet there was something else. Something no report ever put in print. The house felt alive. Reporters, neighbors, even the coroner said they felt watched as they stepped over the threshold, like something in those walls had learned to breathe. History tells you, a drifter did it, or a jealous rival. But history always writes down what is safe, not what is true. The evidence says this was no random violence. It was a ritual, a performance for something unseen. Every curtain drawn, every mirror veiled, every body arranged with care. What you are about to hear is not the story you were meant to know, because solving Villisca would have revealed a truth that terrifies the powerful. A truth that still waits in that little white house at the end of a quiet street. And as the sun rose over Iowa that morning, the first lie about this murder was already spreading. The people of Villisca tried to erase that night, but the house refused to let them forget. Neighbors stopped walking on that side of the street. Children crossed the road rather than look at it. Some swore they saw a figure moving behind the curtains long after the murders. Others heard footsteps creaking across the attic floor even when the house was empty. When the investigation began, the truth was already being buried. Detectives found cigarette butts in the attic where someone had waited for hours, maybe all night. They found basins of bloody water, as if the killer calmly washed his hands between killings. They found every door locked from the inside, which meant whoever did it walked out calmly and took the key. But the strangest thing was how the bodies were arranged. Not dumped in fear, not hacked apart in rage, they were almost displayed. The axe was wiped clean and leaned carefully against the wall, as if it too was part of the show. Reporters poured into town hungry for a headline. They took souvenirs from the crime scene, buttons, scraps, even pieces of skull. Crowds trampled the yard and peered in the windows before the sheriff could rope it off. And yet through all the chaos, the house stayed silent, holding its secret. Soon stories spread that the curtains moved at night, and voices whispered through the floorboards. One man swore he smelled kerosene and iron just walking past. Another claimed the air inside was so heavy it crushed his chest like invisible hands. Visitors left pale and shaking their shoes damp with something they could not explain. But the biggest question remained, why would anyone do this, and why here? Theories pointed to a jealous rival, a vagrant preacher, a traveling serial killer. But none of them explained the details. None of them explained the ritual like care, or why the mirrors had to be covered, or why no one ever heard a sound. And that's when the first cover-up began, one that still hides a name. We are not supposed to say out loud. The investigation should have been simple. 8 people slaughtered in a single night in a town so small, strangers were noticed instantly. But within days, evidence began to vanish, and suspects began to slip away. Sheriff officers gave conflicting statements. Witnesses changed their stories, and certain names were never written down at all. The governor sent investigators who left with no answers. The local coroner claimed the crime looked like work done in complete darkness, by someone who knew exactly where every bed stood. Then he stopped talking about it altogether. One witness swore he saw a man walking down the dirt road at sunrise, carrying an axe wrapped in cloth. He was never questioned. Another neighbor recalled hearing faint footsteps after midnight, a door opening. Then silence. Her testimony was dismissed as hysteria. And what about the basins of bloody water in the kitchen? What about the lamps turned so low they barely burned? What about the precise way every face was covered? All of it was mentioned once and then buried under official reports that used words like random, tragic, senseless. But there was nothing random about Villisca. Nothing senseless about it. Someone was protecting this killer, or protecting what the killer represented. Because this was not the first family found butchered in their beds in 1912. Across the Midwest, entire households were slaughtered with axes, and the killers were never caught. The newspapers whispered about a wandering madman, but the patterns suggested something colder, something organized. Each scene had the same markers: curtains drawn, mirrors, covered lamps dimmed, as if the darkness itself was part of the ritual. By the time the grand jury convened, the case was already poisoned. The lead suspect walked free, the sheriff resigned, and Villisca was left with 8 graves and no justice. But the house did not forget. The floorboards still carried the weight of footsteps long after the family was buried. Visitors claimed to hear breathing from the attic when no one was upstairs. Others woke from sleep in the guest room with deep scratches down their arms, like something reaching out from a century ago, refusing to let go. And that is when the second disappearance happened, one that almost erased the truth forever. Years after the murders, the Villisca house sat empty, paint-peeling windows, cracked wind hissing through the frame. But when carpenters tried to renovate, they tore open the plaster and found strange stains deep inside the walls, too dark, too old to be paint. Every strike of the hammer released a smell like iron and rot, as if the house itself was bleeding. Neighbors said tools vanished overnight and were found arranged in patterns on the floor when the men returned. One worker swore he heard footsteps pacing above him. Yet no one was upstairs. Another quit, after his ladder shook violently while he was alone. The house was no longer just a crime scene. It had become something alive, something hungry. And with each strange event, the truth about the murder slipped further away. Documents vanished from the courthouse. Letters written by the Moore family disappeared from evidence. Even the bloody axe itself was misplaced, then reappeared with pieces missing. By the time locals begged officials to reopen the case, it was too late. The town had been told to move on and the files were sealed away. But you can seal paper, you can't seal wood. And the Villisca house kept whispering through its floorboards. If you think this was just the echo of fear, remember this. Every family that rented that house after 1912 moved out within months. They all told the same story. Doors opening on their own, heavy breathing in the halls, whispers calling their names at night. Children woke crying that someone was standing over their beds holding something shiny in his hands. And just when people thought it couldn't get darker, another name connected to the murders suddenly vanished from the record, a man who had been seen near the Moore house days before the killings. A man who had ties to others slain the same way in other towns. He was questioned, then released, then never mentioned again. And that erasure was no accident. Teed was the fingerprint of an invisible hand steering the entire investigation into silence. But this hand didn't just protect one killer, it protected an entire pattern, one stretching far beyond Villisca. Most people believe Villisca was a freak act of violence, a single madman with an axe ending 8 lives. But step back and the map tells a different story, from Colorado to Kansas to Illinois. Whole families were butchered between 1911 and 1913. Every murder struck on a quiet night. Every murder used an axe found at the scene. Every mirror covered, every curtain drawn. Lamps turned low bodies positioned with care. Police in each town blamed drifters, carnival workers, jealous lovers. But the truth slipped through like smoke, because the killings stopped as suddenly as they started. No arrest, no execution, no confession. just silence. Some investigators whispered of a death cult moving by rail, striking homes chosen for reasons no one understood. Others suspected a secret society performing rituals to test their recruits. Even the federal government quietly gathered reports but never released them. So was Villisca part of something larger? Look at the signs. The killer lingered after the murders, eating food, calmly wiping the axe. That isn't rage, that is devotion. This was someone performing, not hiding, but who were they performing for? And why did powerful men make sure we never heard their names? Pause for a second and ask yourself, was this ritual or random? Type ritual or random in the comments right now, because I want to see how many of you are awake enough to see the pattern. Because when you look closely at Villisca, you stop asking who did it. You start asking what they were serving. And that question leads us somewhere much darker than one small town in Iowa. The attic of the Villisca house is small, cramped, almost suffocating, but it tells the clearest story of all. Cigarette butts in the dust, footprints in the wood, a depression in the floor where someone sat for hours listening to the family breathe, waiting for everyone to fall asleep. Visitors today swear the attic still holds that presence. Paranormal teams record cold spots, shadow figures, disembodied voices. Even skeptics walk out pale and trembling. One man said he felt someone breathing against his neck. Another heard a faint humming like a lullaby out of tune. But the real horror isn't the ghost stories. It's the fact that in 1912 the sheriff knew someone hid there, and still no arrest came. Either the killer had protection or the killer was the protection. Because while Villisca slept, something ancient walked through that house, and when the killing was done, it didn't leave. It never left. Ask yourself this: why would a man cover mirrors and draw curtains if he feared being seen? What was he afraid of reflecting back at him in the glass? Was he hiding from neighbors or from something else entirely? The deeper you go into this house, the more it feels like it wasn't just blood that soaked into its walls. It was something older, older than Iowa, older than America itself. And this is where the story begins to turn from murder into something forbidden. In the courthouse archives, a name should have been there. A man seen near the Morehouse the week of the murders. A man whose movements lined up with 3 other axe killings across the Midwest. But in the official records, that name does not exist. Witness statements mention him only in whispers. A traveling preacher with strange eyes and a voice that made children cry. He carried a heavy satchel and spoke about sin like it was a living thing following him from town to town. People remembered him because he never blinked long enough, and he asked too many questions about families who slept with their doors unlocked. He was detained, questioned, then released, and every note about him disappeared as if someone reached into the files and tore out the truth, page by page. Who had that power in 1912? Not a drifter, not a lone madman, only someone inside the system, someone who decided this case should remain unsolved. Years later, a single torn document surfaced during a probate dispute. A letter mentioning that same preacher by name. It described his sermon the night before the murders. Words about blood cleansing the earth and houses that could not hide from judgment. The letter was quickly locked away again, and the family who found it refused to talk. So why did the authorities shield this man? What was he really doing in Villisca? Was he hunting alone, or was he part of something that reached far beyond one farmhouse? The deeper you dig, the more it feels like Villisca was never meant to be solved, because solving it would expose something worse than murder. It would expose design. This was not chaos. This was a pattern, a shadow walking in daylight protected by hands we still can't see. And once you know that pattern exists, you begin to recognize it everywhere. In other murders, unsolved, in other investigations, buried in other names, erased from history. And just when you think you found the two, Ruth, you hit another wall, because the preacher was only one piece of the puzzle. The real power behind Villisca wasn't holding an axe at all. It was sitting in an office wearing a badge, signing papers that made evidence vanish. And that power is still here, still operating, still deciding which truths you are allowed to hear. But there's one thing they could never erase, something still hidden inside the house itself, waiting to be found. In the courthouse archives, a name should have been there. A man seen near the Morehouse the week of the murders. A man whose movements lined up with 3 other axe killings across the Midwest. but in the official records that name does not exist. Witness statements mention him only in whispers, a traveling preacher with strange eyes and a voice that made children cry. He carried a heavy satchel and spoke about sin like it was a living thing following him from town to town. People remembered him because he never blinked long enough, and he asked too many questions about families who slept with their doors unlocked. He was detained, questioned, then released, and every note about him disappeared as if someone reached into the files and tore out the truth, page by page. Who had that power in 1912? Not a drifter, not a lone madman, only someone inside the system, someone who decided this case should remain unsolved. Years later, a single torn document surfaced during a probate dispute. A letter mentioning that same preacher by name. It described his sermon the night before the murders, words about blood cleansing the earth and houses that could not hide from judgment. The letter was quickly locked away again, and the family who found it refused to talk. So why did the authorities shield this man? What was he really doing in Villisca? Was he hunting alone, or was he part of something that reached far beyond one farmhouse? The deeper you dig, the more it feels like Villisca was never meant to be solved, because solving it would expose something worse than murder. It would expose design. This was not chaos. This was a pattern, a shadow walking in daylight protected by hands we still can't see. And once you know that pattern exists, you begin to recognize it everywhere. In other murders, unsolved, in other investigations, buried in other names, erased from history. And just when you think you found the two, Ruth, you hit another wall, because the preacher was only one piece of the puzzle. The real power behind Villisca wasn't holding an axe at all. It was sitting in an office wearing a badge signing papers that made evidence vanish. And that power is still here, still operating, still deciding which truths you are allowed to hear. But there's one thing they could never erase, something still hidden inside the house itself, waiting to be found. When the house was restored, workers tearing away insulation found it. Not initials, not a date. A symbol burned deep into the beam with something hotter than any farmer's tool. It looked like two crossed lines, but wrong, slanted in a way that made your eyes ache if you stared too long. Around it, faint circles, like someone traced a wheel with shaking hands. Carpenters swore it wasn't part of the original frame. Investigators dismissed it as kids carving nonsense years later. But here's the problem. The wood around it was untouched by rot. No dust settled in the grooves. It looked fresh, as if someone had drawn it yesterday. Locals called it a witch mark, a ward to keep spirits out. But others, older farmers, said the opposite. They said that mark was an invitation, not to keep anything away, but to call something in. And it didn't just appear in Villisca. That same crooked symbol shows up in old police photos from unsolved axe murders in Colorado Springs, in Kansas, even as far away as Oregon. Always near doorframes, attics, barns, always where families died in their sleep. So ask yourself, was this a drifter leaving his calling card, or was he serving something? Something that demanded fear as payment. The preacher they never charged used to tell congregations, "The earth is full of sleepers, and only blood wakes the ground." He spoke of doors you could open without keys, doors carved in wood and soul alike. He never explained what came through those doors. If Villisca was chosen, it wasn't random. It was marked long before the axe ever swung. But there's something else no one talks about. A diary entry found decades later by a neighbor's grandson. The entry is short, written the week before the murders. Someone has been in the attic. The dust is disturbed. I hear him breathing at night. He isn't waiting for us. He's waiting for them. Who are they? And why would a single farmhouse in Iowa matter to anyone beyond its own fence line? Because that mark in the rafters isn't just a clue. It's a warning. And if you trace it carefully, line by line, you'll see it points somewhere else, somewhere darker. And that's where we're going next. Villisca was not the first, and it wasn't the last. Before that June night in 1912, entire families were being butchered in their sleep. in Colorado Springs, in Monmouth, in Paola, Kansas. Always small towns, always near train lines, always with an axe left at the scene, wiped but not hidden. Police called them copycat crimes. Reporters blamed hobos riding the rails. But a few detectives saw something else. The same odd details in every house. Curtains drawn after the killings, mirrors covered, lamps turned low, and in at least 3 of those homes, the same crooked symbol burned into rafters or door sills. The killings stopped as suddenly as they began. No trial, no confession, just silence. The kind that feels bought, not earned. So who paid for that silence? One investigator, years later, drunk in a bar, claimed they were told to look away. Orders came down from men I'd never met, men who didn't wear badges. Then he leaned closer and said something that still rattles those who remember it. Those murders weren't a man's doing. They were a man's offering. If that's true, what was he offering to? And why did the trail run cold right after Villisca, like the job was complete? Some researchers built a map of the killings, pin by pin. And when you connect the dots, something eerie appears, not random at all. The towns form a line across the Midwest, a line that points east toward the heart of old power, toward circles that meet in silence. Now ask yourself, why does no one teach this in schools? Why is Villisca just a ghost tour now, when the truth should terrify us all? Because it's safer to sell you tickets than to tell you who draws those lines in blood. We're halfway through this descent now, and I want you to decide, were these killings ritual or random? Stop right now and type it in the comments. Just one word. Ritual or random? Let's sup. How many of you see the pattern? But whether you comment or not, understand this. The murders were never meant to be solved. They were meant to be seen, and the right people saw them. What did they see? Something so old, it doesn't need names. And we're about to meet it. George Kelly was not like other men of God. He was small, nervous, a stranger wherever he went. But when he stepped into a pulpit, his voice changed. Witnesses said it was sharp, almost metallic, like something speaking through him. He wandered from town to town, always by rail, always where the Axe Murders followed. His sermons were not about grace or salvation. They were warnings, veiled as scripture. He spoke of a harvest of souls, of doors that must be opened with iron, of blood as the only true ink for the covenant. In Villisca, he preached the Sunday before the murders. He told the congregation, "The sleepers will be awakened. The sacrifice must be made." No one understood him then. After the bodies were found, people remembered every chilling word. Kelly confessed once, briefly, saying voices told him to kill. But the confession didn't stick. The trial collapsed. He walked free. Officials called him insane, not guilty. But here's what they never told you. His hotel room after Villisca was searched. On the table was a scrap of paper with a drawing, that same crooked symbol traced in ink and ash. Next to it, a single phrase scrawled again and again. "The night listens." Who was he writing to? Who listens in the night? Some think Kelly was a madman looking for attention. Others believe he was a vessel, chosen because of his weakness, his fear, his need to be noticed. He didn't summon the darkness. It found him, it used him, and then it cast him aside. After Villisca, Kelly vanished from the headlines, but not from history. Fragments of his letters survive, sent to unknown addresses in Chicago and St. Louis. Letters talking about the work continuing, about more doors being carved. So who protected him? Who made sure the only man who confessed to the crime never spent a day in prison? And why do those letters end so abruptly in 1914? As if he'd been silenced, or worse, absorbed into something bigger. The preacher didn't just serve a congregation. He served something far older. something that required him to speak in riddles, and to draw blood not for himself, but for an unseen master. And that master didn't stop in Villisca, because after Kelly disappeared, the murders didn't end. They just got quieter. Next, we're going to uncover the message hidden inside those crimes, a message meant for men in power, not for you. But you're about to hear it anyway. Most people saw Villisca as horror, 8 people butchered in their sleep. But the right people saw something else. They saw a message carved in silence. The killer left no tracks, no fingerprints, no clear motive. But in the arrangement of the crime scene, in the way the curtains were drawn, in the sequence of the killings, a pattern spoke. Not to police, not to neighbors, but to men who already understood the language of fear. Think of it this way. When nations send secret signals, they don't write letters. They stage events. They leave symbols. They move in ways only insiders can decode. The Villisca murders were no different. The covered mirrors, a sign of death in old European occult practice. The untouched valuables, proof the motive wasn't theft. The calm linger of the killer, cooking food in a house full of bodies. Proof this was not frenzy. This was ritual precision. And then there was the axe itself. The blunt side used on adults, the blade on children. A hierarchy of death, as if the murderer followed a rulebook. Someone wanted this scene staged perfectly, like a dark performance, a warning, or perhaps an invitation. Reports say certain men from Des Moines and Chicago arrived quietly in town within hours. Not police, not family, but interested parties. They never gave statements, never appeared in newspapers. They walked the rooms, took notes, left without a word. What did they see? A calling card. A reminder that power isn't won in elections or boardrooms. It's won in rooms where no one screams because no one is left alive to. The murders were not random. They were read, like scripture, by those who deal in shadows. A blood-written letter saying, "We are still here. We still control what you fear most." And what happened next? Nothing. No real investigation. No trial that held. A silence so heavy you can almost hear who it serves. The truth. Villisca was never about catching a killer. It was about watching who kept their mouth shut. But why would anyone send such a brutal message? What were they threatening or promising? Because just weeks later, something very old and very powerful shifted hands in America. And if you think that's coincidence, wait until you hear what happened in Washington next. 2 weeks after the Villisca murders, something strange happened in Washington. Men who had been bitter political enemies were suddenly meeting behind closed doors. Newspapers hinted at a quiet reconciliation, but no one explained why. Senators who wouldn't even share a table at dinner were now shaking hands in private, smiling as if they'd seen the same ghost. Lobbyists whispered of new arrangements. Rail barons and bankers began moving money, fast, into projects nobody would name. The timing is too sharp to ignore. The message of Villisca wasn't just murder, it was leverage. Someone demonstrated power, the kind of power that says, we can strike anywhere, we can erase anyone, and we do it without being seen. The elites in Washington understood. They didn't speak of it in public, but they got the point. If this force could erase an entire family in a quiet Iowa town without leaving a trace, what could it do to men in office? A single bloody night shifted alliances faster than any speech or vote. Suddenly, deals that had been stuck for months passed in silence. New banking measures, railroad protections, and military appropriations, all approved with barely a whisper of debate. Someone, or something, used Villisca to send a reminder to the ruling class. The real rulers don't run for office. They don't debate bills. They don't ask permission. They take. And if you cross them, you vanish. You and everyone in your house. And it worked. No one in power ever called for deeper investigations, no federal inquiry, no grandstanding, only silence. Does that sound like justice? Or does it sound like obedience? Because men at the top knew this wasn't random slaughter. They knew it wasn't madness. It was a demonstration, a handshake written in blood, and they shook back by falling in line. So the question isn't who killed the Moors. The question is, who needed? It 8 bodies to send a single silent signal to Washington. And if this was a warning shot, what deal was sealed in that quiet Capitol room? And why was it worth more than human life? Next we go deeper. We peel back the layers of protection and show how every unsolved killing that followed drew from the same hidden script. Villisca wasn't the first, and it wasn't the last. Between 1911 and 1913, whole families were wiped out in the dead of night across the Midwest. Paola, Kansas, Colorado Springs, Colorado, Monmouth, Illinois, always near rail lines, always with an axe, always with curtains drawn and bodies posed. Authorities called them copycats. But look closer. The timing, the geography, the eerie precision. You're not seeing random killers. You're seeing a traveling signal. Someone, or some group, was moving like a ghost across America, leaving messages in blood. In every case, valuables untouched. In every case, mirrors covered. In every case, neighbors swore they heard nothing, as if the killer moved through houses like smoke. Even stranger, in at least 3 murders, fresh kerosene was poured over bodies but not lit, as if to leave the smell of fire without destroying the evidence. A warning without a blaze. What kind of man commits murder this way? Not a drifter, not a vagrant. This was methodical, military in its precision, ritual in its details, and above all, symbolic, a calling card only certain eyes would recognize. Newspapers back then tried to connect the dots. For a moment, the public started to wake up, but then came the editorials insisting there was no link, the expert panels claiming coincidence, the sudden drop of coverage, like someone yanked the story off the front page and shoved it into a dark drawer. Who has the power to make mass murder vanish from memory? Who tells the press to look away? Not some lone lunatic with an axe. This takes infrastructure, money, authority. This is how power hides in plain sight. They don't erase the crime. They erase the pattern. And without the pattern, the crime looks meaningless. Just another tragedy. Just another crazy man on the loose. But you're starting to see it, aren't you? This wasn't chaos. It was chore, eography. A slow dance of death performed for an audience of the few, and those few understood every step. And here's where it gets worse. If these killings were signals, then Villisca wasn't an endpoint. It was a doorway. Something was being prepared. Something only the initiated could see. Next, we descend deeper, into what was really waiting on the other side of that doorway. And once you hear it, you'll never think of unsolved murders the same way again. The deeper you dig into Villisca, the less it feels like a murder, and the more it feels like a message from something ancient. Think about the details again. Mirrors covered, as if to keep something from watching. Curtains drawn tight, not to hide from neighbors but to hide from the night itself. The killer didn't just slaughter. He prepared the house, almost like an altar. Old cultures believed mirrors trapped souls, that if you killed a man in front of his own reflection, part of him would linger, restless. Covering the mirrors wasn't madness. It was method. Someone wanted the dead to stay quiet, to not speak from the other side. And then there's the way entire families were wiped out in a single sweep. This isn't personal rage. This is purification, a cleansing of bloodlines, as if erasing names from some invisible ledger. Ancient cults did this. Modern power does it too. Different tools. Same belief. Fear is control. When investigators walked into that house in 1912, they didn't just see blood, they smelled it. Heavy, metallic, choking the air. One deputy swore the air felt thick, like it was alive. These aren't the words of a man describing a break-in. He was describing a presence. And here's the darkest part. In the months after Villisca, local ministers, men who preached every Sunday, started whispering about something in the fields. They'd heard footsteps at night, seen lights moving where there were no roads. A preacher even claimed he saw a man with no face watching from the edge of town. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe the killer wasn't just a man. Maybe he was a messenger. A servant of something older than Iowa, older than America. The kind of force elites still bow to when they need a reminder of who's really in charge. This is why Washington stayed silent. They didn't fear exposure. They feared attention. They feared if people looked too closely, they'd see what was moving behind the curtain. And they'd realize it didn't start in 1912. It started long before that. And it hasn't stopped. Next, we trace how the killings shifted, moving underground, evolving into quieter tools of control. You'll see how the axe became a pen, and why the blood never really dried. The killers didn't vanish, they evolved. You can only terrify a town with an axe once. After that, people arm themselves. They grow suspicious. But if you terrify them with invisible forces, markets, wars, laws, they never see the hand holding the blade. After 1912, the Midwest killings faded. But the same patterns, fear, manipulation, silence, reappeared in new forms. Banks collapsed mysteriously. Farms were seized overnight. Entire communities fell into debt slavery without a shot fired. The power that once swung steel in the dark now signed papers in broad daylight. Look at the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, slipped through just a year after Villisca. It centralized control of money in private hands, while the public was distracted by murder trials and rumors of demons. Coincidence? Or was the chaos useful cover? When men are afraid of shadows in their own homes, they don't notice strangers writing the rules of their lives. The same year, newspapers began to change. Independent voices were bought out, silenced, or ridiculed as cranks. The people who once told you who was killed now told you what to think about it. The weapon had shifted from axe to ink. And that's how control works. Physical terror is loud, psychological terror is quiet, but it lasts longer. A man who sees an axe killer will arm himself. A man who sees his neighbor's farm repossessed will kneel to the banker and call it progress. The elites learned something at Villisca. They saw how fear paralyzes. They saw how horror isolates, and they learned to do it without spilling blood. If you frighten a population enough, they police themselves. They whisper instead of shout. They obey instead of question. But make no mistake, the same current runs through both. The axe and the pen serve the same master, power without accountability. And once you recognize the handwriting, you'll see it everywhere. Here, from the laws that crush small men to the wars fought for reasons no one can explain. We're about to cross another line now. Up to this point, you've been looking at murder and money. Next, you'll see how both feed something far older, something that wants more than obedience. It wants belief. Every system needs fuel. Your car burns gasoline. Your body burns food. But the machine that controls men, it burns fear. And Villisca was overflowing with it. When 8 bodies were found in that farmhouse, Iowa froze in its tracks. Children slept with guns under their pillows. Men took shifts on porches all night. The fear didn't stop when the blood dried. It lingered. It spread. And someone, or something, fed on it. Here's what people miss. The killer didn't run. He lingered. He ate their food. He washed his hands. He stayed inside that house while their bodies cooled. It's almost as if he wanted the walls to soak up the terror, as if the house itself was being prepared, not as a crime scene, but as a shrine. Old civilizations understood this better than we do. They believed human terror was an offering, that when blood was spilled in ritual, unseen forces grew stronger. The Aztecs called them gods. Medieval cults called them angels or demons. Today, we call it coincidence. But look closely at history. Every empire that ruled absolutely had its sacrifices. The modern elites simply learned to do it without the dagger. Wars, depressions, assassinations. The machine doesn't care what form the fear takes, only that it multiplies. When men feel helpless, they turn to whoever promises safety. And those in power are always happy to sell it, at the cost of your freedom, your wealth, even your soul. But here's the secret no one dares say. This machine isn't entirely human. Power attracts power, and for thousands of years, kings, priests, and politicians have whispered to something they don't fully understand. And it whispers back. Sometimes it asks for a war. Sometimes it asks for a family in a farmhouse. This is why Villisca was never solved. Not because they couldn't find the killer, but because they couldn't name what he served. You don't prosecute a man who's just a vessel. You cover it up. You move on. You keep feeding the machine, and it's still feeding today. Pause for a second. What do you think? Was Villisca random murder, or was it ritual? Type ritual or random in the comments. Let's see how many of you see the pattern. Next, we pull back the curtain on exactly how that pattern spreads, from a single farmhouse to an entire nation asleep at the wheel. Villisca was not an island. It was a warning shot, and almost nobody heard it. Just 2 years later, Colorado miners striking for fair pay were slaughtered in Ludlow. Entire families burned alive in their tents while the press called it necessary. Around the same time, mysterious axe murders appeared in Kansas, Illinois, and Louisiana, all unsolved, all eerily similar. Different men swinging, same invisible hand guiding. And while the newspapers screamed about lone madmen, something else slipped through. New federal laws centralizing power, secret banking deals behind closed doors, silent appropriations for wars we hadn't even entered yet. Fear in the streets gave cover for power in the shadows. Look deeper, and you'll see it. The mirrors covered in Villisca. You find that same ritual detail in a Louisiana farmhouse murder a year later. The curtains drawn? Same in Illinois. Always a family, always asleep, always no witnesses. It's like someone was rehearsing terror, testing how far they could push ordinary Americans before they demanded answers. But no answers ever came. The authorities were always too slow, too confused, too eager to blame drifters or Negro fiends or anyone but the people who benefited from the chaos. Every murder scene was treated less like evidence and more like an inconvenience. Burn it down, board it up, bury it fast. And while the blood dried, new laws passed, new fortunes rose. See the rhythm? Murder, fear, confusion, control. Repeat. By the time America entered World War I, the population was so numbed by headlines of slaughter, both at home and abroad, that sending their sons to die overseas seemed normal. That's the real crime. A nation conditioned to accept death without question. This is why they call Villisca America's most haunted murder. It's not just about ghosts in a farmhouse. It's about a sickness in the blood of power itself. A darkness that didn't end in Iowa, but spread coast to coast. And it never stopped. The faces changed. The weapons changed. But the design stayed the same. Now comes the question no one asks out loud. If the killer was never caught, if the murders kept repeating, If the fear kept feeding something, what exactly was being built? Because whatever it is, it's still here. And we're about to stand right in front of it. The Villisca house still stands. Tourists walk through its rooms now, snapping photos where children once bled to death. Some laugh, some whisper, some swear they feel a hand on their shoulder when no one's there. But the house isn't just a haunted tourist trap. It's a doorway. You feel it the moment you step inside. The air isn't heavy because of ghosts. It's heavy because it remembers. Wood absorbs pain. Walls drink fear. A century later, the boards still creak under the weight of something left unfinished. A contract signed in blood that was never closed. Stand at the threshold of that house, and you'll notice the strange silence. Even the wind outside seems to stop. And if you listen carefully, it feels like the house is asking a question. Not, who killed them? That question is too small. It's asking, do you see now? Do you finally see how this world works? Because Villisca isn't just about an unsolved murder. It's about the machinery behind it. The same machinery running this country today. The doors you walk through every day, banks, courts, schools, they're built by the same kind of men who knew how to use fear as fuel. That's the real haunting. Not the axe, not the blood, but the design. The killer walked freely through this door over 100 years ago, and when he stepped back out, he wasn't alone. He left something behind. A mark, an infection, a current that still hums through the floorboards. You can feel it if you're quiet long enough. It isn't supernatural. It's worse. It's human power whispering with something older than humanity. The locals will tell you about footsteps, shadows, whispers in the night. But the real whisper is louder than all of that. It's the whisper that told America to stop asking questions, to sleep through the slaughter, to bow when the machine says bow. And now you're standing at the door too. Once you walk through, you can't go back to ignorance. You start seeing it everywhere. In headlines, in politics, in the way fear is sold like bread. Which leaves us with one last dissent. Because if Villisca was the doorway, what's waiting on the other side isn't a ghost. It's something far more real and far more dangerous. This is where I leave you, at the edge of the doorway. You've heard the story of Villisca, but you know by now it's not just a story. It's a mirror held up to America and to you. The killer was never caught because catching him was never the point. The point was fear. The point was obedience. And it worked. Look at the world around you. Every time there's chaos, every time there's blood, who benefits? Who grows richer, stronger, safer, while you grow more afraid? That's the same question the Villisca house asks. And if you've been listening closely, you already know the answer. You were never supposed to hear this. You were never supposed to see the pattern. Most men won't. They'll scroll past this video, shake their heads, go back to sleep. But you're still here, which means something in you refuses to sleep. So here's my challenge. Prove you're awake. Comment the phrase, "I see the door," twice below. Burn it into the algorithm. Burn it into your own mind. Show the machine you won't look away anymore. And when you lock your door tonight, ask yourself, are you keeping the darkness out or keeping yourself in? That house in Villisca may be silent now, but what it served is not. The machinery still turns, the current still hums, and men still disappear when they ask the wrong questions. The real haunting isn't in the walls of an Iowa farmhouse. It's in the blood of a nation taught to fear its own reflection. You've seen behind the curtain now. You can't unsee it. So the only question left is, what will you do with it? The Villisca killer may be gone, but what he served is not. And tonight, when you close your door, ask yourself, is it really locked?